This is it, folks. The culmination of all the knowledge I've attempted to share with you has led us to this point. It's time to talk about building skill games. Building a skill game will require many of the tools we've discussed in previous tutorials. If you're not yet familiar with impulses, triggers, events, data sources, filters, and operators, you're going to want to go back and check out those lessons before you jump into skill games. As I'm sure many of you are aware, in Trials Evo, the possibilities when it comes to skill games are immense. Using the tools in the triggers and events categories, it is basically possible to program your own game that has nothing to do with riding Trials, the bike, or the rider. These types of skill games, however, can get very complicated, so in the interest of time, we're going to create a basic skill game using the bike and rider, so I can show you how to actually set up the skill game in the track settings. Coming up with crazy new ways to use this is on you. We're going to build a hill climb skill game. For those of you who are not familiar with Trials HD, the hill climb skill game is simply an uphill track, and the goal is to get as high as you can. The rider who reaches the highest point is the winner. There is an example of this type of skill game in the example tracks that you can load up in the editor through the start menu. I've already built the basic logic to score the game, so I'll just quickly describe what is happening here. We've got a set value event that pulls its value from a distance operator and sends it to a variable data source. This event is activated by an interval trigger that is sending an impulse every tick, but first it passes through a generic filter, which checks the value in the distance operator to make sure it is greater than the value in the variable data source. This ensures that the maximum height achieved is always the value in the data source. Otherwise, that value would decrease if the player started to descend. We also have an end event activated by either the player crashing or bailing out. Now that we've got that out of the way, we can check out how to set up a skill game in the track settings. We'll begin by hitting start in the editor and scrolling down the track settings. Then we will select game mode settings, and from there slide the game type slider to skill game. This will bring up the options for creating a skill game. Difficulty, allowed bikes, medal times, and track description are all options we've discussed before. Although one difference in medal times is that this will adjust how you input the values based on what you choose as your primary score. Instructions, just like track description, will bring up the virtual keyboard so you can enter any special instructions the player will need to know in order to play your game. These instructions will appear on screen during the countdown at the start of your game, just as they do for the in-game skill games. Set primary score will bring up a submenu that lets you choose how the game will be scored and how that score will appear on screen for the player. By default, this is set to time. You can also choose faults or data source. In our example, we will be using the height the rider reaches as our primary score, so we will set this to data source. Next, we decide where our score will be displayed on screen. We have 5 options here. Top left, top center, and top right will all display the score as a number in those positions on the screen. Left and right will display as a bar on either side of the screen. You can see a visualization of what each one will look like to the right of the menu as you scroll through the options. The visualization slider lets you change the appearance of the score. For the numerical scores, the options will be different shapes for the black frame that the score appears in. For the left and right, it will change the color and shape of the bar. Again, you can see what these will look like to the right of the menu. Next, I'm going to skip down a few to format. This basically decides how it interprets and displays the values. Our first option, generic, is a basic whole number. Time obviously uses the time format of minutes and seconds and thousandths of a second. And distance uses meters with up to 1,000th of a meter. You will be able to see how this value will be displayed on screen just as you could with placement and visualization. Now we can jump back up to min and max. Using these two options, you can set the minimum and maximum score. When using the numerical displays, it's good to make sure the maximum value is at least as high as the highest possible score. However, when using the bar, you need to be a little more exact. If your max score is set to twice as high as the highest possible score, the meter will only ever be able to reach half full. Likewise, if your max score is set lower than the highest possible score, the meter will fill up all the way, but the player will be able to continue playing. Since we're using a numerical score and I don't yet know the max height of the level, I will just set the max to 100. If in testing we find that the player can get higher, then we can come back and adjust it later. The sorting order determines how players will be ranked on the leaderboards. Descending means that the highest score is best, while ascending means lowest score will be the top of the leaderboard. The label will appear on screen with the score. As you scroll through the options, they will appear in the preview to the right of the menu. There are quite a few to choose from. Since our score is based on height, that's what we'll pick. Finally, we'll select our value target. Since our score type is set to data source, we need to let it know which data source to use. Choose Select Value Target, then use the cursor to select our variable data source that's holding the height information. Once we make this selection, the words primary score will appear above the data source in the editor. Now let's back out and do a quick test to make sure it's working. We still have some more options in the track settings, so let's go back in and check them out. Our next option is Set Secondary Score. The secondary score will determine how players who achieve the same primary score are ranked on the leaderboards. Selecting this option will bring up a submenu, basically the same as the one we just looked at for primary score. However, you can choose to have no secondary score, so in type, you will have the extra option of none. For our example, a good secondary score is time, so I'll set that. I'll place it in the center and change the visualization to the rectangle. Minimum value is of course 0, and maximum is automatically set to 30 minutes, which is the maximum time you can use in any game type. For sorting, we set it to ascending since we want the faster times to be best. Now that we've set that up, if two riders get the same height, the rider who gets it faster will be first on the leaderboards. Our next three options all add additional counters to the game. These counters will not affect the score, but can help the player by giving them visual cues to other things going on in the map. Say for example, we want to also have our rider on fire, and we want to let the player know how closely they are to dying. While you weren't paying attention, I set up the logic for this, which is pretty basic. A fire effect with an area trigger to a fire event will start the rider on fire at the beginning of the level, and we can use the game variable data source set to bike fire amount to track how close the rider is to death. Now back in our track settings, we will select Set Counter 1. This is again basically the same submenu we had when setting the score. Our type will be data source and placement will be left. Our minimum value is 0, and we know from the game variable data source info that the maximum fire amount is 1000, so we'll set our max to 1000. Format will be generic, and we'll set the label to fire level. And of course, our value target will be the game variable data source that is tracking the bike fire amount. And now we're done. We've created an In Flames hill climb skill game. Let's give it a test run.